The quest for quantum supremacy in computers. Has the digital game changer arrived? We'll get you up to speed right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. Let's turn to high-tech computing. Google said recently it achieved a significant breakthrough, which it called quantum supremacy, by developing a so-called quantum computer. Some say it's an important milestone, a revolutionary way of processing data, but there's still controversy in the field of quantum computing. Before we get down to a discussion about this fascinating development, take a look at what really happened.
Has quantum supremacy arrived? Google said last week that its research team achieved a big breakthrough in quantum computing, claiming it attained quantum supremacy. Official confirmation came in a paper published in the science journal Nature. The company said the quantum computer Sycamore could do a mathematical calculation in around 3 minutes that would take a Summit supercomputer, the most powerful in the world today, 10,000 years.
For many years, practical quantum computing was only theoretically possible. Google's team has proven it can work. This is the hello world moment for quantum computing that many of us have been waiting for.
Some scientists have compared Google's findings to the Wright brothers' first flights, but skeptics believe Google is overselling its achievement. IBM said a supercomputer with additional disk storage could finish the calculation in less than 3 days, with greater accuracy. It also said Google risks misleading the public by implying the new style computers would replace existing ones, while quantum supremacy in the strictest sense had not been achieved. The professor who coined the phrase quantum supremacy weighed in.
If you just say quantum supremacy has been achieved, that can be very misleading, because it doesn't mean you can throw your ordinary computer away because quantum computers are now supreme. What it means is that we kind of open the door to real applications of quantum technology, and now we're going to have to play around with these quantum computers and get a better understanding of what the important applications are going to be.
Quantum technology has been researched and developed in many countries, including the US, Japan, and China. For example, in China, the famous Professor Pan Jianwei's work in the field of quantum information and quantum communication has been recognized by many international peer-reviewed journals such as Nature and Science. Scientists have said quantum technology can be used in broad areas, including communication, information security, and high-tech research. How can quantum computers potentially change our lives?
Well, for more on quantum supremacy, let's turn to our panelists. They have much better knowledge than me about this. In Lancaster, we have Robert Yang, who is the director of the Lancaster's Quantum Technology Center and Quantum Base. Welcome, sir. And also in our Beijing studio, we have Zhang Fan, who is an associate professor of gravitational wave and cosmology at the Beijing Normal University, but certainly fascinated about the quantum technology. Right. On the other hand, we also have here Andy Mock, our current affairs commentator, also senior fellow from the Center for China and Globalization. Welcome as well. Okay, so we still cannot throw our ordinary computer away, Mr. Yang, even with this quote-unquote quantum supremacy?
That's absolutely the case. And
oh,
yeah, I think I should start by saying that the phrase quantum supremacy is somewhat misleading because it does not mean that quantum computers are universally better than classical computers. All Google showed was one particular calculation that their quantum device was better than the best classical computer. And that calculation wasn't particularly exciting. So it's really the tip of an iceberg and the start of a new revolution.
I see. Well, are you guys just being kind of phenomenon of sour grapes? Well, maybe the Google only did it. The other guys didn't do it. So you have this sour grape phenomenon in a way. Is that true, Zhang Fan? Tell me more about that.
Well,
Can we throw away the computer now?
Not in my case. I'm not involved in this work, so I'll be
right.
honest and just and say, unfortunately, you can't do that. Well, if you want to go back to Stone Age, sure.
No.
Yeah,
Of
but
course.
if you want to replace that with a quantum computer, no. So this one is particularly the task that it was doing was particularly suited for the quantum computer, and it's trying to ask the classical computer trying to mimic what the quantum world does, and that's really difficult. So it's really stacked against the classical computer. No wonder it does better, but that's a good start.
Yeah, if I understand your words right, is that the quantum computer that we are talking about today, which is developed by Google this time, only could perform the result that it's on its own to achieve. In other words, it does not necessarily have the capability yet to be able to accomplish the mission as we ask the computers to do.
Pretty much so. It's not a generic computer.
What a relief for me,
programmable.
with someone with a liberal arts background.
Wow.
But what about for you, Mr. Mark? What's next? You know, we've been hearing about computers for decades now, from 1930s when there's so-called the Turing machine. That was the very basic of computers. Look at where we are. Every one of us has a smartphone in hand. It produces and runs much faster than an ordinary computer 3 years ago, let's just say. Are we going to see quantum computing also in that speed?
So I'm going to take the other side of this and say that,
How come you always want to take the other side of it?
keeping things interesting.
Okay, go ahead,
Keeping
sir.
things balanced.
Okay.
So I think that while our other guest was absolutely correct, that quantum supremacy is very, very narrow, and it's different from what we might call quantum value. Meaning, does this really change the lives of consumers or even businesses?
You better answer that question right now.
It doesn't. It doesn't. But here's, I think, what's important. What you talked about, the enormous changes in our lives we've seen through smartphones, everything from classical computing, really is in the world of bits, meaning electrons. So as Peter Thiel, one of the early investors in Facebook, joked quite famously, we expected flying cars, we got 140 characters, meaning we expected the classical computer revolution to change the world, and all it did was give us Twitter. I mean, he was exaggerating.
But you know, it's interesting because it really shows certain kind of theory or logic here, right? Mr. Yang, because so-called the nature is not classic. In other words, we cannot expect what we had before, whether it's logic or the way of doing things, to be repeated in a totally different world of technology. That is something I learned, even though that's also an old logic anyway. So, Mr. Yang, how should we understand the world of quantum computing and the logics and development, evolution of it, compared to, let's just say, the computer time, the computer evolution?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So quantum computing, quantum technologies are incredibly
liberal
exciting.
arts background. Yeah. Go ahead, sir. Go ahead, sir. Mr. Yang.
It's really, really exciting. It's really, really exciting. You know, if you think back 70 years, it was incredibly difficult to predict how digital communications and digital technologies would influence our lives. And we're at this precipice where it's incredibly difficult to know exactly how quantum technologies are going to influence us in the future. But the one thing we do know is it's incredibly exciting. We know certain problems, certain algorithms which quantum computers can perform faster than classical computers. And so there are some very exciting new protocols which will be implemented on quantum computers in probably less than a decade. So I absolutely agree that the future is really interesting.
Oh, I would agree with that as well. But if you look at the prospect, I was trying to learn something before coming into the studio. And it was like what the ordinary computing, you know, even the fastest supercomputer that we have today, have to do with 10,000 years' time. Can be done in quantum computing, even with the current technology, be able to finish with 200 seconds. So that is the kind of dramatic change we're talking about here. But, you know, with that dramatic change, even at the very initial step, how is it going to transform our world? Do we know?
We don't know for sure. Well, that's my opinion. So
Okay.
first of all, just a disclaimer. Google claims it's 10,000 years.
Yeah.
IBM claims it's going to be 2.5 days. So that's a caveat.
Okay,
But-
okay. Because we have something going on between the two of them, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
But in any case, so in the shorter term, I think it's pretty sure that in the near future, in 3 to 5 years' time, there's going to be specific uses for particular quantum computers. For example, one thing that's highlighted by Google people is that you can simulate chemical reactions using quantum computers because it's based on quantum mechanics already. But in the far future, when you try to do what normal computers do every day for us, like video streaming and that sort of thing, general computing, then you need a large, very, very complicated quantum computer. And I'm not entirely sure. I'm not an expert on this, but I'm not entirely sure whether that's possible at all.
Yeah, this comes a very interesting question for us. In other words, Fan, if I could just follow up before going to Andy, that is, are we going to see quantum computing, being called at least that, be able to replace the kind of computers that we have today? Or is it going to be more interactions as quantum computing developing with a already matured computer science that we have seen today? So how does that work?
So certainly a lot of people are advocating the first choice, that's complete replacement of the current one, and a lot of people think that's the third step. Currently, the quantum supremacy is the first one, funding uses is the second one, and the third one is general purpose quantum computers. But I think even if you don't arrive at the third step, just there's something called heterogeneous supercomputing. That means you have a cluster you have a big computer, but the computing chips in it are all different. You have GPUs, CPUs, all that sort of things. And adding quantum computing specifically to deal with certain tasks, and then having the other stuff deal with the more mundane stuff, and also try to organize everything, I think it will be useful already.
Very interesting. Mr. Yang, your opinion. This is a very important question, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And I think classical computers will always be better than quantum computers at certain tasks. So there'll always be a place for the normal computers that we know in the world.
Are you just trying to be diplomatic, Mr.
And,
Yang? You are just trying to say to your science department and computer department,
not
say,
at all.
oh, you guys are not going to be out of job, even though I'm still here doing research and step forward.
No, not at all. If you look at how a classical computer works, you know, it has billions of transistors in it, and the way that it linearly processes data is always going to be useful. That's just a plain fact, and I'm certainly not being diplomatic.
Okay. Mr. Mark, you've been listening to your colleagues. Your take?
Well, let me use maybe an analogy here. So quantum computers, one way you can think about them, they're super, super fast. So think of it like a Ferrari. It's a super fast car. Classical computer, we can think of it as like a dump truck, right? So they do completely different things. And in this way, I think that quantum computing will not completely replace classical computing. But where the impact is, I want to add to what you were saying, was that the world of atoms, meaning that classical computing brought us amazing advances. But they haven't solved problems like how do we have better drugs? How do we have better materials? Because they all rely on molecules. And what quantum computing allows us, or will allow us to do, is to really manipulate, design much larger molecules. And what that means is we can change our physical world, not just the digital world. And to me, that's the exciting thing. But what I really want to add here, what's very interesting, is that Google says 200 seconds versus IBM's supercomputer of 10,000 years. That's a 1.5 billion times difference, right? But let's look at this. If IBM is right, and if they had configured the supercomputer correctly, they could have solved that problem in 2.5 days. That's about 1,000 times faster than Google's quantum computer, which is a big multiple. But this also means that there's still tremendous upside for classical computing, because 2.5 days to 10,000 years, that multiple is very large.
Well, you know, one of the things that I can't judge, and I guess neither of you could do, is be able to see who is right in this sense, whether it's 10,000 years or actually 2.5 days. But one thing is very important. It shows the debate and the competition that is going on about quantum computing is not just nation states, China, United States, Japan, and others, but rather also among the business world as well. So here's the question about who will be the leading players in this regard, Mr. Mark. That is an exciting question to tackle with, because we've seen already business community plays a leading role. For example, you look at Facebook, Twitter, and others, at least for now, for the current round of fourth industrial revolution, Mr. Mark.
Well, I hope the winners will be all of us, meaning that we see one world where it's a bifurcated, balkanized world, but I think technology innovation works best in an open world. So hopefully we'll see. I think Google, of course, is doing exciting things. Yeah. IBM is, as is Baidu, as is Alibaba, as is Tencent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the world will be better if these advances are able to be shared versus siloed.
Mr. Yang, of course, coming from the UK, I'm sure you're thinking about, when is UK going to catch up about all of this latest evolution? Not to mention nation states, but also companies. You have IBM, Google, Alibaba, Microsoft, Intel, you name it, and many other small and medium-sized that is trying to catch up in this revolution as well. So who will be the winner? What does it take so far with the knowledge, limited knowledge we have about quantum computing as the winner? Money, talents, or something else?
Yeah, so you're right. The money, all of the above. But the important point with companies is you're customer driven, so you're problem driven. You have to have a problem that the quantum computer can solve, and that there's value in delivering that solution. And so there are lots of different applications, and there'll be many, many different companies. And of course, I have my company as well, so Quantum Base is a company that I co-founded. So there are so many different companies which are up and coming in the field of quantum technologies, and it's really exciting to see the diverse range of applications that they're
Mr. Yang, if I could just ask further, can you, those in the field, be able to predict or have a sense as to what is the next stage of quantum computing, and at least what can be some of the most applicable applications as a result of the development for common people like me sitting in the studio or anywhere else in the world?
Yeah, so the next stage is really scaling up. So quantum computers are incredibly sensitive to their outside environment. So any form of noise disrupts the operation of the computer, and it causes errors. And those errors really limit quantum computers today. So there's a big engineering push to building bigger and better systems for containing quantum computers so we can make them more powerful. And in terms of applications, I think the most exciting near-term application will be in things like designing molecules to do very specific jobs. So we heard about chemical interactions earlier on, but there's also designer drugs. Imagine a world in which we can take a disease, look at it under a microscope, so look at the actual virus or bacteria under a microscope, and then design a molecule, a drug, to target that disease. And I think that's a really powerful, relatively near-term application of quantum computing. It will change our lives.
While you were talking, the lights in the eyes of Mr. Zhang lightened up. I could tell. You're fascinated about all the latest development, even though you know much better than all of us. But to you, what about the latest development with Pan Jianwei, for example, a well-known scientist from China, several years ago, also his paper in Nature. Of course, this time Google has also got a paper being published in Nature. How does that work? China's the latest development, cooperation, competition among all the players?
So certainly among the commercial entities is more of a competition, but because most of the development in China is driven mostly by academia, so there's more sort of cooperation. The thing in particular about China's effort in this direction is that it utilizes a different technology. It goes in a different route than Google and IBM. Google and IBM uses superconductors, while the Chinese team uses photons. In the long run, I don't know which one is going to win out. Currently, in terms of computing capabilities, the photon one is falling behind. But if you add on communication between quantum computers, quantum teleportation, that sort of things, then photons may still have a run. So that's why you need many different competitions.
Exactly, as much as possible. That really makes things better. all roads leads to Rome. Who knows, right?
Yeah.
At this point. But thank you so much for the three of you. I know much better about quantum computing before I sit down in this chair and talk to you. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Robert Yang, Zhang Fan, Andy Mark. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us, World Insight CGTN, into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook. And from me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.